All right. I'm assuming everybody is able to see my screen now. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be talking about identifying true and false denials in drunk suspects. And I'm going to just try and dive right into this. One of the first questions that somebody might have when you hear that I'm talking about detecting deception in drunk suspects is, well, are we actually interrogating drunk people, right? Does that really matter? And the answer to that is a definite yes, and we know that from a variety of sources. So we have that from police surveys, where they have reported that they regularly interact with intoxicated suspects. We also know that from the suspects' self-reports as well. Alarmingly, this does include juveniles who have been questioned while intoxicated. And I know many of you are not in the United States and might be thinking, wait, this doesn't make any sense to me. That's not allowed in my country. In the US, it's absolutely legal to be questioning intoxicated suspects. And they can waive their Miranda rights, give a statement, it can be used against them. So the next question is, well, should we be concerned about this, right? They're being questioned, is that a problem? And the answer to that is less clear than the answer to the question of whether they're actually being questioned. So one thing that might come to mind is, well, maybe they're more prone to suggestion. The research on this is pretty mixed. There's been a decent amount of it, but some studies find that they are more suggestible, some find that they're not. And some of this is likely due to so many methodological differences. So, for example, is the intoxication happening at the time of encoding of an initial event versus at retrieval, or both? So that is a question that's still outstanding a bit. We could also be concerned that maybe they'd be more prone to making admissions, and more concerningly, false admissions. There's almost no research on this particular question. So far, there hasn't really been evidence to suggest they're at higher risk, but again, the evidence is so sparse that you don't want to rely on that at this point. There's also some evidence that the intoxicated may end up facing harsher interrogations when they're facing a police officer. That's based on archival analyses from a study that Angelica Hagson did. So there's some reason to be concerned, some reason maybe to not be overly alarmed. But either way, what we don't really know about is how intoxication impacts perceptions of veracity when a suspect is providing a statement. So that's what we were setting out to answer in this set of studies. And in particular, we also looked at whether the question of who is making that veracity assessment matters, and whether or not training in some cues associated with truth and lies would also help them make better decisions. So two main hypotheses here. The first is addressed in both studies 1 and 2, and we're looking at whether or not intoxication. So essentially, we're looking to see the effect of intoxication, right? And we're predicting that it'll be easier to differentiate between drunk liars and drunk truth tellers, as opposed to sober liars and truth tellers. And that's because intoxication is known to reduce working memory capacity. We know intoxication interferes with executive function. And so it should be a really challenging task for an intoxicated person to come up with and then deliver a compelling lie. In study 2, we added an additional variable. We wanted to know if training people in what cues to look at would improve their ability to differentiate between those liars and truth tellers. And we thought that it would, and in particular, it would be helpful for the intoxicated, because we thought they might be showing more of those cues. One of the reasons we did this was actually to back up a little bit, because in our first study, all participants were trained in these cues, and so we weren't able to really see what was the impact of that training. So you might be wondering, well, actually, I'm skipping ahead. Let me start here. So in our first study, it was primarily a within subjects design. So we had 3 levels of intoxication: a sober control group, a placebo group, and an intoxicated group. And the sender was either innocent or guilty. So 6 cells there. And then we also had 2 samples that we recruited from. You can see the sample sides off to the side. And so we had a student sample and a community sample. And then we use the exact same stimuli in study 2. And this time we had the same 3 by 2 design to start off with, but we then added in the between subjects variable of whether or not our judges trained in cues to deception and then rated them while watching the videos. And this was a community sample. So where did our stimuli come from? They were drawn from a much larger study that we were conducting. And so what's on the slide right here is the procedure that happened for that much larger study. And I want to draw your attention really to the blue font because that's where the part that you are going to be interested in happened. So there was a drinking phase where participants came to our bar lab and they were randomly assigned to either drink just orange juice, or some combination of vodka and orange juice. In the placebo group, it was a very tiny serving of vodka. Just to add to some believability, they would get like a lime soaked in alcohol to kind of create the olfactory sensation. And in the intoxicated group, they had a larger dose of alcohol that was designed to get them ideally to a 0.08 level of intoxication. Here in the US, that is the drunk driving limit. I know in other places it's similar or perhaps lower. So after that phase, we employed the cheating paradigm that was developed by Rusano et al. And so we had a confederate that either, depending on the randomly assigned condition, asked the participant for their assistance on a task where they were supposed to be cheating or were supposed to be working alone. So in other words, they got them to cheat, or they never asked them for assistance. And so that's how we randomly assigned culpability. And then an interrogator came in and questioned the student, made an accusation that they had cheated on the task. It could be considered academic misconduct. And so that interrogation video is what we used as the stimuli in our current study. So in terms of the procedure of the current study, all participants provided consent. They did some AV checks to make sure they'd be able to see and hear our videos appropriately. They were given a little bit of background about what are these videos that I'm going to be watching. So they were told these are research participants. They were accused of cheating in a task. Some of them did it, some of them didn't. They believe this is a real accusation. So just give them a little bit of context. They were not told how many videos they would be viewing. They were then either trained in some cues to deception or not. I'm not going to get into the training or the cues at this time because that would blow up this presentation. So the DVs I'll be talking about relate to accuracy and veracity judgments. But I will say it was a pretty brief training. In study 1, everyone was trained. In study 2 was randomly assigned whether they got the training or not. Everyone was told for each video, there was a 50% chance that the video portrayed an innocent or guilty suspect. They then watched the video and gave a decision on a 6-point scale ranging from definitely truthful to definitely deceptive. They then watched all videos and repeated that process, but the order was randomized, and then they provided demographics. So our analytical approach was with generalized linear models. In study 1, we had the 2 within subjects IVs, and the way we handled sample was we didn't really have any specific hypotheses about sample. So first we ran an analysis that included sample as a between subjects IV to see kind of as an exploratory measure if there were differences. There were virtually no interactions between sample and any of our other IVs. So we then ran the analyses just disregarding sample, and those are the results that I'll be reporting for the sake of simplicity. But if there was an interaction with sample, that would be noted. For study 2, same IVs at the within subjects level, but we added in that between subjects variable of whether they had the Q training. And our DV was started with that veracity rating on a 6-point scale. We then also dichotomized that so that if they said at least more likely than not truthful, that was considered truthful, more likely than not deceptive, that was considered deceptive. And then of course we looked at the accuracy of that decision. So what did we find? So these are all the effects that were significant, and that's a lot, and we're not going to go through it like that. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that there is an intoxication by culpability interaction for all 3 of the DVs that we looked at. And so I'm going to put figures up on the next screen that really lay out that interaction. The effects on veracity, both the scaled and dichotomous, it was the exact same pattern. So for efficiency, I'm just going to present the dichotomous outcome variable results. So this was a significant interaction, and you're seeing here on the y-axis the percentage of participants that said this person is lying. And if we look at intoxicated suspects, we're seeing that while nobody is doing a great job at this task, they are better at saying that the guilty suspect is lying as opposed to that innocent suspect. Interestingly, for sober, we actually see the opposite effect. There's a significant difference in the other direction, where this sober innocent person is appearing to be more likely to be lying. And for the placebo group, we're not seeing any differences there. When we turn to accuracy, we do see the main effect that we were predicting. So they were more accurate overall for detecting deceit in the intoxicated suspects than placebo and sober suspects, as predicted. We also see the not surprising pattern that those blue bars are higher than the gold bars, right? So they're better at detecting truth than lies. If we focus on, well, what is the significant interaction here? You can see that the benefit of when it comes to looking at truth tellers is there for everybody, but it is of a different size. So it's the largest effect for our sober stimuli, followed by intoxicated, and the smallest effect when we're looking at that placebo group. All right, when we look at study 2, once again, we're seeing that same intoxication by culpability interaction across DVs, though for accuracy, that also is qualified by an interaction with training. So once again, that's how I'm going to frame the results as I go through the figures. So once again, looking at the dichotomous veracity decision, we're seeing that same interaction. And once again, we're seeing this pattern where when we're looking at intoxicated suspects, the guilty suspects are rated as more likely to be lying than the innocent. But this time, there are no other differences. So placebo and sober do not differ. And once again, performance is generally not very good. When we turn to accuracy, we once again find the main effect that they are more accurate when evaluating intoxicated suspects than sober and placebo suspects. And once again, the usual pattern, better at detecting truths than lies. Where we really want to focus here, though, is, well, what is the training doing? And if you're just kind of eyeballing these two figures, you might be thinking not much, and that would be correct. There's only one place where if we look on the left at no training and compare it to training on the right, this bar changes. So the training is helping them better detect deception in the placebo group. Specifically, none of those other differences are significant. So what are the conclusions here? The first one was that our training was not helping, and having them rate the cues, which they were also doing, was not helpful. That said, it was a very minimal training, so I do not want to discount the potential effectiveness of a much more intensive training where we could really make sure that they were paying attention. We tried by doing things like making sure they stayed on the page with training information for a particular amount of time before they could move forward. We asked some comprehension questions before they could move forward. But at the end of the day, it was an online training and we couldn't really monitor what they were doing. Going back to our first hypothesis, that detecting deception in the intoxicated might be easier, we did find that that seemed to be the case. And we didn't find a main effect suggesting that it's just because drunk people look more deceptive overall. There was only that interaction where drunk liars looked more deceptive. So that's all great. Always fun when you see your hypothesis confirmed. There is, however, a big but that I feel I really need to go into, which is some of the weaknesses of the stimuli that we were using. The most important of which is that in each condition, there were 2 videos that we were using. And in one cell, there was only 1 video. You might be asking, why would you do that? We know from work by Levine that you need to have as many senders as possible. That's really important. I promise this was not the plan. Um, we were running that large study where our stimuli came from and had intentions to have a wonderful pool of videos in every condition. And then COVID happened and we had to stop running that study. And so we couldn't collect any more videos. And so we had to work with what we had to work with. So nobody's sadder about those numbers than me. Um, Also worth noting that these were fairly low intoxication levels, typical of what you find in a lab-based study, but not necessarily representative of what would be happening in the real world. And of course, these are student suspects, right? It is a real accusation, but at the end of the day, these are not criminal suspects that you would typically be bringing in for questioning. Um, if I give myself, I knew I added, okay. If I give myself some credit, I do want to point out that there are some strengths to these stimuli in that they're extremely unique. We had experimental control over intoxication and culpability. It was a psychologically realistic accusation, and the senders got to choose whether or not they were lying. And so we didn't force them to make it. They were at the spur of the moment, so to speak, put in a position where somebody accused them of something and they had to decide what to do. So I was afraid I was running out of time at this point. So all I'm going to say about future research is really this area of intoxicated suspects is wide open. There is hardly any research out there. So if this strikes your interest, look into it. It's kind of a pain. I won't tell you that it's not, but it's also fun. And like I said, if it's of interest, I can almost promise you nobody has done whatever you just thought of yet. And with that, I'm just going to thank the rest of my team, the small army of research assistants that are required in order to pull off research like this, and of course, the NSF for funding the work. And my email address is there as well in case you want to drop me an email with any questions you have.